Hello, learners. I'm Dr. Shae, and welcome back to World Literature Unpacked. This week, we're exploring the relationship between children's literature and fantasy literature, and how the two genres often overlap. Many stories written for young readers include magical worlds, talking animals, and extraordinary adventures. But fantasy is not limited to children, and not all children's stories are fantasy. So this week, we'll take a closer look at what defines these genres, how authors use fantasy elements to communicate meaning, and why imaginative storytelling plays such an important role in literature. And yes, this is the part of the course where dragons, magical creatures, and talking animals suddenly become completely normal academic topics. Ready to unpack it? Let's go. Children's literature is defined by the audience. These are stories written for young readers and often focus on themes like friendship, growing up, or learning right from wrong. For example, books like Charlotte's Web or The Very Hungry Caterpillar are written for children and focus on lessons about life, relationships, and personal growth. Fantasy literature, on the other hand, is defined by the content. Fantasy includes things that don't exist in the real world, like magic, mythical creatures, or imaginary worlds. Stories such as Harry Potter or The Lord of the Rings are considered fantasy because they include magical powers, invented worlds, and supernatural elements. Sometimes these two categories overlap. A story can be written for children and still include fantasy elements. For example, stories like Alice in Wonderland or The Chronicles of Narnia are considered children's literature because they are written for younger audiences, but they are also fantasy because they include magical worlds, talking creatures, and impossible events. In other words, children's literature is about who the story is written for, while fantasy literature is about what happens in the story. For this week's written assignment, you will first write a paragraph explaining how children's literature differs from and also includes fantasy literature using examples. Then, from the reading list, choose 2 works that fall under fantasy literature. In your analysis, you will examine the stories using the common elements of fairy tales discussed by Vladimir Propp, as well as Tolkien's ideas about the purpose and structure of fairy tales. In other words, you'll be looking at how fantasy stories are built and what makes them function as fairy tales. And yes, this means you will officially become fairy tale detectives this week. So as you work through this week's readings, remember that fantasy is not just about magic or imaginary worlds. These stories often use imagination to explore deeper ideas about courage, identity, good and evil, and the choices characters make along the way. By looking closely at how these stories are structured, and by applying the ideas of Propp and Tolkien, you'll begin to see that fairy tales and fantasy literature follow recognizable patterns that help shape meaning. So grab your detective hat, look closely at the elements in the stories, and start uncovering how these fantasy worlds are built. I'm Dr. Shae, and I'll see you next time.